I am joined by a very special guest today. It's a company called Hightouch that many of you would already know about. And the co-founder and co-CEO of Hightouch, Tejas Manohar, is with us today. Hi, Tejas, how are you?
Hey, thanks for having me, Aseem. Really excited for this show.
Thank you for joining us. So Tejas, you and I met at a conference, Snowflake event. We were on the same panel together. That was, I think, late last year. And we had a really interesting conversation there around the modern data stack. Now, both our companies are kind of built around the modern data stack and centered around that core idea. And I think there's a shared common vision around the data warehouse becoming the foundation for how the next generation of apps are built on top of that stack. So I want to start there first. What is the vision for Hightouch that led you to start this company?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Aseem. So basically, the reason I started the company, Hightouch, with my co-founders was because we found that enterprises just had so much data laying around the company, but it really wasn't being put to use in business people's day-to-day flow. So I'll give you an example. I mean, we see this all the time, whether it's a B2B company like the ones you work with at Immersa, or whether it's large consumer or retail companies. Effectively, these companies have so much information about their customers, about their financials, about leads that are coming in, about how they're interacting with the website. But a lot of this data is just being used from like a back office or reporting perspective. For example, when a salesperson's prioritizing their day, they might just be blindly going through a list of customers that they talked to the last month and seeing who they should be pinging today, instead of using signals from who's recently logged into the product, or who invited a bunch of users to their workspace, and likewise on the marketing side. So our goal was really to let the business teams or across the company unlock all that data that's in the data warehouse, like Snowflake, and use it in all their systems of action rather than just BI tools.
Yeah, that's perfect. And so for those of you just joining us, you are welcome to ask us questions along the way. We will bring those questions to Tejas and address them here live. If you are not joining us today, you will receive a recording of this call, and which you can share with your colleagues and friends in the industry. So Tejas just outlined the vision for Hightouch, and I think that's what's interesting about both our companies. I used to previously be at Adobe, and part of Omniture business unit that sort of grew into the marketing cloud and the experience cloud business over there. And what we found is there was a lot of data being collected through Google Analytics, Adobe Analytics, previously Omniture. And the real value creation occurred when that data was exposed and made actionable to the end users in the organization. And that's what led to the growth of that business from 70 million when I joined to like over $3 billion over 10 years in ARR.
Crazy.
So there's a similar parallel here that we're drawing into Immersa, where we found, Tejas, to your point about making data actionable, we kind of anchored on product usage data because we felt like there's actually a huge amount of value, and that's a new data asset that's been created by engineering teams over the last decade. But unlocking the value of that data set and we're focused primarily on customer success and sales teams. So unlocking the value of that data for those teams and figuring out where there's churn risk, where there's growth potential, and so on. We're going to do, for those of you who are regular listeners, we're going to do this one a little bit differently. This is more of a founder-to-founder talk, so Tejas is going to ask me questions as well. So go ahead, Tejas.
Yeah, no, it's super cool. What do you think led to Adobe to grow so quickly during the time you were there after the acquisition of Omniture? I mean, 70 million to 3 billion revenue is it's insane, right?
Yeah, so two factors I would say. One, from a marketing cloud standpoint, I feel like the thing that Adobe did best was to invest in the founding team and said, we buy the vision, go ahead and execute. And we were able to conduct multiple acquisitions. We had essentially a lot of brain and accountability to execute and go at it and create a new category. But then the other thing that I think really created value for Adobe's investors is the fact that they took some of the culture and the learnings from that acquisitions and the growth of the marketing cloud and sort of brought that into the rest of the company around the Creative Cloud. So the Creative Cloud moved to a subscription model, taking inspiration from what Omniture was doing
I
at the
see.
time. And obviously something that, the CEO there had been previously thinking about, but it helped accelerate that trajectory as well. So pretty amazing run. I'm really proud of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Adobe's acquisition of Omniture just got them into a totally new space of the marketing cloud, marketing analytics. And it's crazy. A lot of people still see Adobe as just a creative company and don't realize just how large their footprint is in marketing technology and kind of technology for the rest of the business. Something I think a lot about, I'm curious if you have perspective here, Aseem, is, 10 years ago, I think companies saw their source of truth to be something like a Salesforce or, Microsoft Dynamics or SAP or whichever CRM they're kind of using. And everything revolved around there. But as you mentioned, there's tons of new digital signals at all types of companies, B2B companies and B2C companies, and companies are starting to revolve more around the data warehouse, as far as we can tell. Curious if you have any perspective on why this is, or just how the landscape's changed since the time that you were at Adobe.
Yeah. So, clearly pretty fundamental shift in the data stack over the past 10 years. And I think, triggered by Snowflake essentially moving the data warehouse into the cloud led to where you've got the ability to sort of scale up and scale down in a very flexible way, both from an infrastructure standpoint as well from a cost standpoint. I think that's one key part. I think the second thing that really happened in the last 10 years is the growth of SaaS led to such diversification of data sets. We as a startup have about 35, 40 different SaaS tools. The only way to make any sense of that data is to put it into a data warehouse and try to figure out what's really going on in the business. And you look at enterprise scale companies, we saw a study that said over 300 SaaS applications on average deployed at enterprise scale companies. And so that kind of blows my mind that, they've got data in so many different places. How do you actually put it all together? And so while Salesforce is, designed for transactional data sets, and a lot of sales teams that we talk to are pushing, transactional data into Salesforce, from the likes of Gong or Clary or whatever else, makes a lot of sense. But the minute you start to get into other types of data, like streaming data that you typically see, and event streams that you typically see out of product analytics or product streams, it feels like Salesforce falls short because it wasn't originally designed for that kind of data, nor was it designed for that kind of volume. And that's where we believe like the modern data stack is going to be the foundation for the next generation of enterprise apps that are data driven. But I'm curious on your point of view as well, Tejas. So maybe, I'll turn that question back to you. Like, I think we have a similar understanding of the space, but I'd still love to get the additional color from you.
Yeah, no, for sure. So just like you were at Adobe, I was at a company called Segment, actually, before founding Hightouch. And Segment's initial value proposition was quite simple. It was that, hey, companies, the number of SaaS tools at companies is absolutely exploding. And to be effective, they need data, right? Zendesk needs to know, if you're responding to a ticket, you need to know when the last time the customer opened the app was, or what the recent purchases they made. If you're a salesperson, calling up customers to see if they're up for an upsell, you should have information about what they're doing in your application. If you're in a marketing tool, you need to be able to personalize messages to your customers. So many SaaS apps, as you mentioned, and it's an ever-growing count at enterprises, frankly, even in this market. But to actually be effective, those apps need data. So what Segment did was, they created this SDK that you could use on your website, just like Omniture and Adobe Analytics, and track all this user behavior and forward it all to all the different SaaS tools you use. And one thing that started to happen over time is that, the customers of Segment were begging them, can you not just forward the data blindly to all these places, but can you make Segment this kind of like source of truth for my data, where I can do things like build audience of customers, like, hey, here's my high value customers, or build a lifetime value or score, or different things like that. And we started to go in that direction. But something we realized was that it was really hard to build this like one-stop shop platform where companies could manage all their data. Companies data was coming out of every corner of a company, and people were never able to centralize around just a SaaS service, like a very specific SaaS tool like Segment, as their source of truth. And at the same time, over the kind of 4 years that I was there, I did see a rise in cloud data warehouse technologies. So technologies like Snowflake, later became one of the biggest software IPOs around the time of the Segment acquisition.
Yeah.
And I think that just shows the rate of adoption of the technology was just immense. And for the first time, companies were, having this new technology where they could put all their data in and really start to build out the closest thing to a single source of truth across the organization. So what I noticed was that the data warehouse, with the new data warehouse technologies out there and the explosion of data that every business had from a demand perspective, was starting to become like the source of truth of the organization. When you had a question, you would reach out to a data team working in a data warehouse, a BI tool like Looker. But people weren't using it for action. People weren't using this data to prioritize leads or send personalized marketing campaigns or run targeted ads. That was all happening separately through CSVs or APIs or whatever. So I think really why we founded Hightouch was to marry those two worlds together. And honestly, it's not really a philosophical point of view. I think it's something that's essential. I think the data warehouse is kind of becoming the only system where companies can actually build that source of truth, just due to the sheer number of data sources, complexity of data, scale of data. The world that companies operate in from a data perspective is just different than when CRMs like Salesforce or just like typical CRMs were built, and those models are very rigid, very much revolve around basic things like leads, accounts, contacts, stuff like that, and doesn't really amend itself to the modern world that companies live in from a data perspective, where there's all sorts of custom data for the business. So I think the data warehouse technology really came out of the app time around the time of explosion of SaaS and just explosion of digital data for companies.
It's interesting you brought up the concept of actionability, and just my personal experience building out and supporting the digital experience and the marketing cloud sort of domain at Adobe. We saw the rise of CDPs, Segment, and then later on part of Twilio was obviously a huge part of that, but approaching it from the developer side, whereas Adobe launched it from a CDP from the marketer's perspective, right? So similar concepts in terms of what we were trying to accomplish, but very different go-to-market and very different personas. And what I took away from that is that there was an opportunity there to enable other parts of the organization besides the marketing team with similar ways to action data. And personal experience, like sitting in QBRs or quarterly business reviews with the exec team there, we would look at sales data, we would look at customer success data, and within a few clicks, you're quite aware of where the challenges are in the business that need some attention. But the minute you turn towards your CS team or your sales team, they're not in Power BI or Tableau, they're operating in Salesforce and Gainsight. And we've got thousands of people across the world with different contexts, different accounts, different territories, and so on. And translating what the exec team's seeing in these exec dashboards to what the individual sales team in a country in Europe needs to do different in their account base was just a huge manual process that was supported by program managers sending out emails with spreadsheet attachments with a list of accounts, which, to me felt like it was missing the entire point of like, why go do all this analysis and understand what's going on? Then you can't really affect change in the systems of engagement where those teams are currently operating. And so that's kind of what led to, let's go solve that problem to where we create, that bridge to actionability. So in that sense, I feel like our vision's very aligned, but I am also curious to dig in a little bit deeper to say, how are we approaching the problem a little bit differently? And so I'm curious, like from your lens, like when I think about Hightouch, in the early days, you were really focused on reverse ETL. I think you helped establish a new category in the data stack with the reverse ETL as something new and interesting. But talk to me a little bit more about that. Like maybe let's double click a little bit. I'll share how we're thinking about the problem and love to hear your thoughts.
For sure. So yeah, you hit the nail on it. Our initial product was called reverse ETL. honestly a very simple concept, right? Companies had tons of data inside of tools like Snowflake, and they had tons of business folks from sales to marketing to customer success to finance living in these SaaS tools like Salesforce, Zendesk, Adobe, Marketo, Braze, Facebook ads, NetSuite, you name it, right? And there's a disconnect between those two systems. So reverse ETL, it's the opposite of ETL, or getting data into the warehouse. Very simple UI where you can put in a SQL query and say, here's some valuable information, and then you can easily just sync it to any of these business systems from your data warehouse like Snowflake. And it was a new concept because a lot of data teams were focused on getting data into the warehouse, modeling it, building reports, answering one-off analyses or questions for different business stakeholders, but they weren't focused on how do you, embed data as a part of the business stakeholders' actual day-to-day process, and that's what reverse ETL helped with. And one thing that we realized over time, though, and I guess you also realized this at Immersa, is that reverse ETL, it's a good starting point. It's a great starting point to start, sending data into different parts of the organization. But there are some parts of the organization where the roles are getting very data intensive, and it makes sense for business people to be able to get their hands on some of this data and control how it shows up in their workflows, et cetera. So an example of this that we identified through working on Hightouch and our technical reverse ETL platform for data teams was marketers kept asking data people, hey, can you get me a list of customers who added something to their cart but didn't check out? Or hey, can you get me a list of customers with a high propensity to buy another product based on their demographics and such, but haven't bought anything recently? I want to go engage these in my systems of action. And every day or every week, they would be asking for new lists of customers. So one thing we feel strongly about at Hightouch is that the data warehouse shouldn't just be used by the data team, right? And so we've actually expanded our product capabilities past just reverse ETL to build things like our customer studio, which was initially called our audiences product. And basically what that allows people to do is not just data people to come into Hightouch and put in SQL queries and sync them to systems, but to allow marketers and less technical roles to come in and do things like build audiences off the data warehouse, sync them to ad platforms, sync them to email platforms, and end-to-end start activating their data to personalize customer touchpoints. So very much like what someone would do in an Adobe Marketing Cloud off their Adobe Analytics data, or Salesforce Marketing Cloud off their Salesforce data, but instead off the data warehouse, since that's kind of emerging as the new source of truth or the new CRM in many ways for companies. So that's how we've approached the problem so far. We want to be this universal data layer that anyone can use to sync anything from the data warehouse to all these different downstream tools. And then we've gone deep on the problem of marketing and marketers and helping them use data in their workflow, whether it's for segmentation, running personalized campaigns, A/B tests, et cetera. And that's been sort of the evolution of the product over the last year or so.
Got it. So I'm going to draw a comparison here to Immersa and then ask you another question on what you just shared.
Go for it.
Very interesting in how our two businesses sort of started out, and our thinking is very, in a sense, similar in that we think that there's data available out of data warehouse that can be very useful in other contexts, but we chose a different starting point and the problem statement to go after. We're focusing on product usage data, product adoption data, the dark data that sits in engineering organizations that is very influential in figuring out product roadmaps, but today barely scratches the surface in helping customer success and sales teams figure out how users are actually using their product and therefore what to do with it. So we kind of took the same concept, but applied it to a very different domain, which is enabling that collaboration between the product leader and the go-to-market teams. And the product leader was being asked the same question, which is, can you unlock this data and make it available to me? And which of my customers are actually using my product beyond what they had originally planned for, or which ones are actually not using the product enough and are likely to churn? And so looking at that streaming event set and marrying it to or combining it with account information and users, et cetera, from your CRM, and then unlocking the value of that data is kind of the data, the primary use case and the market that we've currently focused on. So it's essentially applying the concept of what I saw with CDPs at Adobe applied to marketers, but applied to a very different data set in a different domain. And there's different sets of
revenue teams, customer success teams.
Yeah, the problems and challenges associated with this domain are in the technical sense somewhat different than what we saw with CDPs. But I am curious, from a positioning standpoint, do you see Hightouch evolving into a CDP, or because you are today associated to reverse ETL as a category, but how do you see this evolving from a positioning standpoint over time?
Yeah, no, it's a great question.
And I don't need to put you on the spot, because I know that's one of the hardest because we're always iterating on that. But I am curious to hear your thoughts on what you think about the problem.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the $1 billion question, but it's the big question, right? For sure. So at Hightouch, we've always had an interesting relationship with the CDP category. We don't really see ourselves as a typical CDP solution. I think when people think the word CDP, they think it's some sort of all-in-one platform you're going to go buy for your marketing team and solve all your data problems, right? And a lot of the pitch of a CDP to marketing teams is that you don't have to work with the data team or the IT team anymore. And that's why some of this software sort of sells like hotcakes, because at a lot of enterprise organizations, the relationship between those two teams is very dysfunctional, frankly, at a lot of companies. And it's a hard one to get right as well. Like in B2B companies, sales and marketing is also difficult to get right. But frankly, our belief and thesis from the beginning was that the source of truth of a business is going to be the data warehouse. It's not going to be some sort of off-the-shelf CRM or CDP type solution you're buying. B, the only way for a company to have an effective data-driven culture is for the data and the business teams to work well together. So those are two strong tenets that we have as we think about our Hightouch and what we're building our platform for, what we stand for. So we don't consider ourselves a CDP. I mean, we think of ourselves as more of a data activation platform. Companies have data today. How do you activate that data and start using it in all your business workflows and the way you engage with customers? But we compete with CDPs very often, and people see us as an alternative to CDPs. And there's kind of a term that's emerged in the market called a composable CDP, which is like, hey, why do you need to go buy an off-the-shelf CDP? If you have a data warehouse over here and has tons of data, why can't we just turn that warehouse into a CDP with a platform like Hightouch? And that's a term we've been, evangelizing as well in our marketing, because we think it makes a lot of sense. So yeah, many of our largest customers, PetSmart, Warner Music, et cetera, are using Hightouch as an alternative to purchasing a CDP. But I think the way our solution works is just fundamentally, very different. It would be dilutive to just call it another CDP, if that makes sense.
Got it. That makes sense. Look, I think so the composable data platform, I think it's a Bessemer paper that came out that spoke about it. Very interesting thought, and it sort of lines up to this idea of taking the concept of a CDP that has been traditionally applied to the marketing domain and applying it to other domains. And that's sort of where we started out as well. And I think we would align in the vision that number one, the data warehouse is the future for how applications evolve, and that becomes the data foundation for the next generation of apps. And number two, the activation layer is what's going to help create the value on the business side, not just looking at the data. And so where we've kind of focused our attention on is that relationship between the data owners and the data consumers. And the data owners typically have a huge amount of understanding on how data actually works, and they can ask all the right questions of it, but they don't necessarily always have the business context. And then on the business side, we see that the business owners have a clear understanding of how the business works, and they're constantly iterating on that, but don't have the vocabulary or the language to ask the questions of the data that they need answers to. And there's a cooperation, but there's also some conflict in that relationship in many companies that can be pretty dysfunctional. And really, I see Immersa's vision as sort of eliminating that conflict. And somebody on our team put it really well the other day, which is, you can either go sell paintbrushes and art supplies and canvases to, which is how I see the modern data stack today. Like, you have the Snowflake data warehouse, you have, this ETL tool, you have this other tool over here to do, BI on top of it and so on. Or you can sell the joy of painting. And our goal and motivation is to sell the joy of painting to the painter, which in this case, we view that as the business user. So how do we connect the dots across the modern data stack and empower the business user to ask the questions they need to ask? So that's sort of the way that we're approaching the problem.
No, I think that makes sense. And we have the same mindset. I think the only way to truly be successful is to have tools that bridge that gap between the data team and what's going on in that data warehouse type world and the business teams. Just focusing on it from different business teams angle. Once you start working with these business teams and business problems, it just gets so deep, whether it's product-led growth and B2B companies or consumer companies and marketing personalization and managing, $100 million type ad budgets that some of our customers do. Just so much depth to those problems, and each of those roles is just becoming so data driven in its own way. So it's really exciting.
So Tejas, obviously we're seeing a huge emphasis and focus on data in the organization, and companies, I believe, have been data rich, but and even now I would say insight rich, but poor in actionability and connecting the dots. Is sort of the place that I see where the market is today. How do you see this evolving? What do you see as the modern data stack anchored by Snowflake is sort of how I view it, with a dozen different components around it that everything from monitoring your data pipelines to focusing on data quality to ETL data in, reverse ETL data out, look at it from a BI standpoint and create the reports and so on, and then kind of driving actionability off of it. There's a whole bunch of different categories. Then you get into data security, privacy, governance, PII, there's a bunch of solutions. So how does this all evolve as you kind of look at this and say, well, next 5 to 10 years out, where does this lead?
Yeah, 100%. So, I think you named a lot of things, right? When it comes from data observability, consent management, compliance, all of these things sort of require the business to be able to operate on a strong source of truth of data. Kind of our perspective is that you can buy whatever CDP solution there is online from Adobe or SAP or Salesforce or any of these players, but in order to truly be successful, the CDP needs to be attached to the source of truth or the data that's being used across the whole business. And that's what we think is wrong with the CDP space today, is that a lot of CDPs are operating in silos. People think they can just get all their data into this marketing system and operate there, but it rarely happens at enterprise organizations where data is being created left and right. So yeah, our belief is that all of those processes you mentioned, frankly, will start to revolve around the data warehouse, just because it's the only place where all the data lives. And the future of business tools like Immersa and Hightouch and even marketing tools will need to adapt themselves to live on top of the data warehouse, or to some extent, they'll go extinct in the same way that on-premise, software has been displaced by a lot of SaaS software. I think SaaS software that doesn't mold itself to live on top of the company's data warehouse will see a similar pattern. So that's our belief, and we are consistently pushing the boundaries of those concerns. We have, I think, more advanced observability, of what's going on, or also, managing tools to manage concerns like consent and privacy and compliance than a lot of CDP solutions offer out there. But all directly happening on top of the data warehouse where every part of the company is contributing data into.
Got it. Yeah, look, I think, we're sort of looking at the world in a slightly different way, and what we're seeing is that with the rise of, ChatGPT and these huge focus on AI systems, like what feeds the training models for these systems is data. And so if you think about the user experience of the B2B user in the enterprise, the last 2 big shifts that occurred. One was the move to the browser, which led to Amazon-like experiences as the goal to shoot for the B2B enterprise user in the app. And then the second one was to mobile, which led to, can I create a mobile interface experience in the B2B apps? And I think that front end experience is going to evolve again to co-pilots, which developers are very familiar with. And with your background, I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. But what we're seeing now, like 40% of the code checked into GitHub is generated through co-pilots working in conjunction with a human. And so I see no reason why there should not be a co-pilot for every human in the enterprise, where the experience today is I click in 6 different applications in the CRM domain to figure out what's going on in my account. Instead, why can't I simply ask a question of a co-pilot and then goes finds that information from wherever it sits in my organization and presents an answer back to me in real time? But to do that, agree with you on the concept that the data warehouse is going to be the foundation, but I also believe that there's a data intelligence layer needed on top of it that can feed these new next generation of enterprise apps that will emerge. And that's kind of where we're positioning ourselves, and the direction at least we're thinking of today is where Immersa goes off into.
No, that's spot on. Actually, share that belief very much. I mean, there's a lot of demos online saying, GPT to SQL. Look how well, ChatGPT is generating SQL queries on my data set or whatever. But in reality, I mean, you go walk into a large company, and even if whether you have a data engineering team that's been producing data for years and writing ETL scripts or using a Fivetran or something like that, these data warehouses are filled with thousands of tables and tens of thousands of tables. And it's not easy for something like GPT or a human to figure out what's the right table to query. How do these things relate to each other? Like, it can work in a small demo, but if you want this to work at an enterprise scale, there needs to be a layer on top of the data warehouse that actually says, what's the meaning behind all this data? How does it connect together? What is this users table? How does it relate to an accounts table? How does it relate to my household table? How does it relate to my Salesforce accounts table? And which is the right one, which is actually the source of truth versus some raw data. So I think, companies like Immersa, companies like Hightouch are building out that domain of, what is the golden data at your business and how does it relate to each other? And only on top of that can successful co-pilots or data-driven workflows be built. So totally on the same page there. I don't think the data warehouse is going to go, commoditize any of these business workflows. The business workflows are just going to have to adapt for all the explosion in data in these warehouses, as well as SaaS tools that exist at companies.
Yeah. So I want to take this to somewhat of a close now. I mean, it's been a really interesting conversation, and I'm curious how you think about what advice you might have for data teams that are evaluating, like, a lot of data teams have invested heavily into the modern data stack and built out a bunch of infrastructure. What advice should you have for these teams as they're looking ahead?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, I think, frankly, I think the modern data stack is good, right? The tools that have come out in the market over the last few years in the data stack have been revolutionary to a lot of the workflow of data teams. I'll give you an example. I think without platforms like Fivetran, it would be impossible for a company of Hightouch's size, we're around 100 employees today, or even a startup below a few hundred employees, to even use a data warehouse. Just like, how is it feasible to get all your data into this thing without a tool like Fivetran, where you can log in with Salesforce, log in with Zendesk, connect to your Postgres database, and magically the data starts showing up. Otherwise, our company would need a team of three data engineers. So I think the modern data stack has been revolutionary in terms of making the data infrastructure accessible to more and more companies, and really reducing the amount of headcount you need to be a data-driven company. But there's also a lot of tools in it. So I think the most important thing for any data team to be thinking about at this time is, don't go on a tool buying spree. Don't go to try to mimic the modern data stack architectures that you're seeing online. Just figure out what's the top problem you have in your business, whether it's building a catalog or getting new data into the warehouse, or improving the workflow of transformations. And just take it one step at a time, and really be thoughtful to where you're spending efforts on the tooling side, and what tools you're adding to your stack, because there definitely is a cost associated with new tools, both from a SaaS perspective as well as a resource perspective. So
yeah, that's great. Good advice. And I think the way that we kind of approach that, what we advise a lot of the data teams is to your point, that there's a huge amount of value available out of the data warehouse today. It's just not being unlocked for everybody in the organization. So we push on this idea of making data available or data intelligence available to every business user in a way that's self-service for them. And that will lead to a completely different level of innovation and value creation in the business. So look, let's pause here for our discussion today. I think this has been fantastic introduction to both Hightouch and Immersa. And in fact, one of the questions I got asked when I invited you to join us for this discussion, well, aren't they competitors? And the way I look at the market is actually, and I think some of that has been answered today in this discussion, in that we have a shared vision of how the industry evolves, but we're tackling different use cases, different personas, different problems. And I think there's huge amount of room to run in this domain. It's just literally scratching the surface as far as where we are collectively as companies and others in this business today. So I'm really excited for what the next 10 years look like. I'm really excited for both Hightouch and Immersa and how they grow from here. And if we compete, we compete. If we collaborate. But the goal is to lift the industry and create something new and exciting. So with that, if people want to talk to you and reach out to you, what's the best way for them to find you?
Yeah, so on most social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, my username is just my name. So Tejas Manohar, and feel free to reach out directly.
Awesome. And similarly, you can find me on LinkedIn, and my email is aseem@immersa.co. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. If you have any questions for either Tejas or myself, please do reach out. We are always looking for exciting speakers to join us for this podcast and webinar series. If you'd like to join us, or if you have somebody in mind that we should talk to that can help advance the conversation on how our industry can grow, I'd love to get that reference from you. And please share this podcast with others and invite them to participate.